I'd like to call up our first panel. We're excited to welcome to the stage veteran federal leaders who have done this sort of thing before. The Data Act requires a transformation of technology that is government-wide. It's not the first time that has happened. When I move my head like this, it means you can come. The Data Act requires a transformation that will involve every agency. And it is a challenge, but it isn't the first time that we've done that. We're excited to welcome Gregg, the former Fiscal Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Chantale Wong, the former CFO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and Phil Bond, the former Undersecretary of Commerce, because in each of their cases, they have achieved transformations of that kind. Moderating the panel, we're very pleased to welcome BackOffice Associates. The interesting thing about BackOffice Associates is that they are managing a project for the Treasury Board Secretariat in Canada that looks just like the Data Act. We didn't know about it when we began working on the Data Act 4 years ago. The Canadian Treasury Board didn't know about us, and yet the adoption of standards across Canadian agencies looks just the same. BackOffice is leading that, and I need to let you know that they now do have a table out in the exhibition area, so feel free to ask them about that. Please join me in welcoming Jason Ludwig of BackOffice Associates.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to take these off because I can see my notes are you, and I'm going to pick my notes. I'm Jason Ludwig. I'm Vice President and the Public Sector Industry Lead for BackOffice. I want to tell you a little bit more about what we're doing up in Canada before we dive into the panel discussion. The Canadian government, for their financial management transformation initiative, has been looking for efficiencies. They've been looking for increased access to their financial data. And their initial approach was consolidation, to consolidate all of their financial management systems to one instance at the Treasury Department. And they brought Gartner in to do an assessment of that strategy, and Gartner said it's going to take 10 years and $1.2 to $1.6 billion. And it's not going to completely solve your problem. And here's why. They have all of their operational systems that are feeding data into their financial management systems and consuming data from those financial management systems. And by moving all of the data to a single instance at Treasury, they'd in a sense be transferring the burden for the access to that data to the individual agencies and those operational systems. And the other thing that they looked at is just the scope of that type of consolidation would have huge business impacts, business process transformations that would need to be done. So BackOffice worked with the Canadian government to come up with a solution. And that solution is a harmonized standard view of the data across the government. We're working with them to define data standards, to develop transformations, mappings, and a solution to disseminate that information across the government. So that sounds pretty familiar. It sounds a lot like what we're doing here with the Data Act. The point is this: the only way to provide the data that we need to do our jobs, whether it's at the federal government, state and local municipalities, or industry, the only way to provide that data without a business process interruption is through the implementation of data standards. The standards are the core of the FMT project, and they're the whole point of the Data Act. So with that, I'll go through a brief introduction of our panelists and kind of kick this off. Chantale Wong has 23 years of experience in the federal government, and she was previously Vice President and CFO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. We have Gregg, who is the Commissioner of Public Debt for 10 years and is the former Fiscal Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. And Phil Bond, who is the Undersecretary of Commerce for Technology and the Chief of Staff for the Secretary of Commerce. So what I'd like to do is really just jump into this and have our distinguished panelists start talking about some of their stories of technological change, what they've seen, what they've done, and how they were able to work through that. We'll start out with Phil.
Thank you very much, and it's good to be here. I want to add my word of thanks for the sponsors, especially these events. As an association pro, I know that these events don't just happen, so a special thanks to them. Well, I stand before you this morning feeling a little bit like Mr. Robinson in the classic movie The Graduate, when you'll all recall he gave exactly one word of advice to young Dustin Hoffman, the character Benjamin, when he said plastic. The word for the digital age would be standards. Standards always unleash innovation and efficiency, always. It may be to one degree or another depending on how the standard was built and derived, but they always result in innovation and efficiency, especially if they include the private sector or if they originate in the private sector. Importantly, that thinking is very much at play with the Data Act. I want to give you 3 quick examples to illustrate what I'm talking about, and it only makes the point, which I think Dick will make more eloquently, that we have seen this movie before. So you think of e-commerce. E-commerce rides really on the confidence that comes from encryption. Encryption, though, if you trace it back, comes from a federal information processing standard originated by NIST that is signed off by the Secretary of Commerce. So the Advanced Encryption Standard was the result of a private sector competition for the best algorithm, which NIST operated, and when they decided the best one, it proceeds up the chain to a signature by the Secretary of Commerce and is adopted first in the federal government, Fortune 1, and then migrates to all of e-commerce. That's one example, and it certainly unleashes innovation and more efficiency with greater security. Secondly, when Vivek Kundra wanted to speed adoption of the cloud, which PSC report out the other day tells us is still not going quickly enough, but when he wanted to do that, he turned to NIST and said, give me a roadmap of private sector standards that already exist upon which the federal government can build and or refine. Smart move, going first to see what commercial standards were there, because in fact the cloud had already exploded across the commercial enterprises. And so while we would like to see more speed in the federal government, again, it was a story of standards unleashing both efficiency and innovation. And then finally, I would point to another effort similar to what the group here has done that's ongoing right now. This is spearheaded by a nonprofit group out in Seattle called the Technology Business Management Council, 1,500 private sector CIOs who have come together and formed a standard around how to value and buy and account for technology in commercial spaces. They have now formed a commission with a handful of federal CIOs to try to figure out if they can crosswalk that and create a costing standard for IT in the very different federal space. But again, it's private sector-led technology standards that will unleash innovation and efficiency. Last point I would make, in this case in particular, you are going to unleash common language, a huge problem for anybody who works in the federal government. You have management from your agency, you have management from OMB, you have oversight from the authorizers, and then you have the appropriators. And I didn't even mention the IG. So to just get to common terms, common language, common understanding, common metrics, common numbers would be a giant leap, and we look forward to it. Thank you.
That's excellent. You know, one of the things that you mentioned talking about that common language, and I think one of the things that people struggle with the government and data in particular is when you're looking at visualizations and you're looking at financial data for a state. How does that play into, is that regional? Is that for the state? And how does that work with those visualizations? So that was really great. Next, I'd like to ask Phil to tell us. I'm sorry, Dick. Yeah, sure. Great. You can sit up there.
Somewhere there's slides. Maybe. The 9 years that was skipped over in my introduction was, I tried to block it out as well for a while, was when I was the commissioner of the Financial Management Service. And the primary reason I was invited to go over there from public debt was because of the Debt Collection Improvement Act of 1996. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and compare that to what we're facing today with the Data Act. Agencies weren't doing very well in collecting delinquent debt back in 1996, and it wasn't much of a priority. So Congress passed DCIA and gave Treasury a primary responsibility to collect that debt. And the reason they did that is Treasury makes 1 billion payments every year, and so they figured that rather than make the full payment, we would deduct the debt that the individual owed, such as tax refunds. So if some of you were expecting a bigger tax refund and didn't get it all, that's probably why. There are many similarities between DCIA and the Data Act. Next slide. One more. There we go. First of all, government-wide. Okay. In both cases, no agency funding. Congress very consistent there. Maybe with the Data Act, they will actually get some funding, and that would be good. Short time frame in both cases. The DCIA was kind of like right now, and the Data Act agencies have a couple of years. Congressional oversight, I think very heavy in the case of DCIA, and I expect the same for the Data Act. Not an agency priority for debt collection. I hope it's better for the Data Act, and I think it is, but again, I expect you'll have a varied response. The current data was suspect. Certainly in debt collection, some of the data that was sent to FMS was not data that we could use to collect the debt. And one of the reasons for the Data Act was because the data, at least in many cases, isn't that good. In the DCIA, we issued a lot of regulations, whereas on the Data Act, there are going to be standards issued, and OMB and Treasury has gone a long ways already in that. A big difference is in the DCIA, everything was system-centric. We've built big systems, big warehouses, and a lot of system changes, and certainly the approach that Treasury and OMB have been pushing, and I think rightly so, is a data-centric approach. What do we learn from DCIA? Treasury is very dedicated to making it work, number one. We had some strong leadership from agencies, not in all cases, but in some cases, and once you get some agencies leading, the others tended to follow. Congressional oversight. I had many trips to the woodshed, the hill, and that was, in retrospect, necessary because it kept us focused and actually the agencies focused because when we were prodding the agencies, sometimes the congressional hearing helped that. Proactive GAO reviews, became good friends with Gene Dodaro, and we were honored to be on the high-risk list for a number of years. Getting off that list is much harder than getting on. The other thing is that some states, after we were going for a while, states became very strong advocates because of the amount of state debt that we were collecting. And to me, technology was very important, but the leadership was key. Bottom line on DCIA, there were some who didn't think it was necessary. In fact, just in fiscal 2013, $6.9 billion of delinquent debt was collected by the Bureau of Fiscal Service. About a little more than half of that was federal debt, and child support and state debt made up the rest. And you can see the importance of our partnership with the state entities. In the 5 fiscal years between 9 and 13, Treasury collected 29.2, and looking ahead to the next 10 years, another 70 billion will be collected. And maybe not all of that, but much of that would not have been collected without the Debt Collection Improvement Act. I think the Data Act is doing it better. Certainly a stronger partnership between Treasury and OMB, which I applaud Dave Liebrick and Dave Mader for that. Proactive communication with stakeholders, much more so than we had with DCIA. An outreach to the Hill. Again, we, in the debt collection, we kind of went and hid and went up when called. Active collaboration with many non-government agencies, such as the AGA and the DTC and the PSC, and as well as others. maybe most importantly, a much better governance structure. They started that right out of the box, and I think it's very important to get this, all the agencies or representatives from the agencies involved. Also, minimizing system changes and not building and rebuilding new systems to the extent possible, and not big databases. And again, as Phil said, data standards and XBRL. The future for the Data Act, I think the opportunity to improve government decision-making is just absolutely essential. No more OMB data calls. Not only are they disruptive and expensive, but it's also, my guess, about 75 or 80% accurate and late. Use of technology and real data rather than sampling for audits, and the opportunity to transform financial reporting, I think, is key. Reduction of fraud and waste, and improved public transparency. For those of you who are soccer fans, those two things, fraud and transparency, if FIFA could, if they had some of that transparency, they might not have had the mess that they're having today. Improve stakeholder access at all levels, and better data private sector innovation. I think that's going to be something that we can't imagine yet what the private sector will be able to do with the information that's going to be available. In summary, the Data Act is transformative, and I'll go Mike Starr one better in terms of ancient quotes. This goes back to 1802 with a note from Jefferson to Secretary Treasury Albert Gallatin. For those of you who can't read it, it says, "We might hope to see the finances of the Union as clear and intelligible as merchants' books, so that every member of Congress and every man of any mind in the Union shall be able to comprehend them, to investigate abuses, and to consequently to control them," end quote. That could be the preamble to the Data Act. So it's up to all of you, all of us, to make that happen. Thank you.
That was really excellent. I think one of the things that we're going to see as a theme as we go through this is, and I think maybe we'll talk a little bit later on the panel after Chantale has a chance to talk, is the innovation side of this. When we open up this data to the state and local governments and to the industry and to the federal government, it's going to be amazing. It's going to be like an explosion of innovation and ideas and changes. So I think that's going to be key. With that, Chantale, whichever. Do you have a Chantale slide? Do we have it?
Well, I could put it up in a few minutes. Thank you. Also, thanks to the sponsors. Thank you, Hudson, and your whole team. You know, you guys are doing a phenomenal job in bringing everybody together around the issue around data. And I live and breathe data now, actually, because I was so enamored by the work I did in terms of data that I joined a data company. It's a tech startup. So today I've been asked to reflect on a couple of disruptive transformations that I've had the privilege of being a part of inside the federal government. One as a civil servant, public civil servant, and the other as a political appointee. So we'll see how those two are comparative. The first one is the budget formulation and execution manager, BFEM as we call it, and many agencies now actually use it. A web-based budget system that I created at the Treasury Department with very little money. We only had about $120,000 in total over 2 years, so $60,000 each year. We were able to sell this program to 15 different agencies, creating from a zero base to a $5 million program. And many agencies still use it today, long after I'm gone. This work was really awarded the President's Quality Award, and that's the public sector equivalent of the Malcolm Baldrige Award for Performance Excellence. The second one is the open data work that I've had the privilege to lead at the Millennium Challenge Corporation that earned us the little small agency, it's a $1 billion agency and it's 300 FTEs, earned us the #1 ranking as the most transparent aid agency in the world, as ranked by Publish What You Fund. It's a nonprofit organization out of UK. That means we were ahead of the World Bank, ahead of UN organizations, and our sister agencies in the federal government, and everybody else. About 350 news organizations around the world reflected this event. It was huge, monumental. First, I want to acknowledge that this stuff is really hard. It's not easy. I think prior speakers have alluded to it. It's a lot stacked up against you. We've talked about the IG, the HR systems, the procurement systems, Congress. Everybody is making you very hard to do transformation, and you are very risk averse because of that. Everybody wants you to looking over your shoulders. They want to play gotcha. If you make any one mistake, you're taken out to the woodshed, as Dick had mentioned. You wonder how in the world to get anything new done. It's very hard. So one of the things that is really hard, it's also been alluded to a little bit, is that we're dealing with complicated and complex legacy systems. They're proprietary, they're locked up, and they're very hard to manipulate, hard to extract data, information from, and they're built from rigid business processes that are no longer relevant, or otherwise they perform poorly. Most people have data they use to manage their programs on Excel spreadsheets. I say that's the best database we have. It's really Excel. And they're all one-off customizations that we built on our desktops that answer in very narrow questions. There are $1 million already invested in current systems that don't work. You all have been there, right? So there are many things stacked up against you. So what are the key ingredients that make these programs that I've had the privilege to work with? So here's my list. I think I need the slide. Is that Dick's slide? Oh, that's my slide? Yeah, okay, that's good. So one is, in the public civil servant job that I had to fly under the radar. Basically, I found, actually in both places, I found that there's a lot of work that you could do under the radar that you don't want to make too much about. My boss was somewhat aware of what I was doing, but not much. I had to do my day job and then do extra that was not part of my performance plan to get to do the innovation work. Second, start small. You can fail small. And not very many people know you failed until you iterate to the success and then you scale, right? I've had to do many of that. I talked about the BFM started with $60,000. The third thing is very important, is to find a crack developer. Those are very rare. They understand your business process, but also can code. So I was able to wave my arms, and he was able to put it into code. Was very lucky. And in BFM, that was that one guy I found. We went and sold these programs to 15 different agencies. We were able to help transform their budget process. By the way, when we went to every single agency, they were managing billion-dollar programs on spreadsheets. And they have actually special names for them. At some agencies, they were called the monster table. At others was the discretionary mandatory. There was one that called it the Zeus table. So we were able to transform all of those into a web-based application. At MCC, I was very lucky also to have a Presidential Innovation Fellow. He, by the way, worked for Vivek Kundra. Vivek got all the credit. This guy actually did all the coding. And he came in with a 2-2-2-2 plan. I asked him, what is that? He told me what I could get done for you in 2 days, 2 weeks, and 2 months. Well, in 2 months, I had data.mcc.gov. Our data was, sets of databases were out there in machine-readable format, and we went on to be #1. So it could be done. It could be done in a 2-2-2-2 plan. 4 is use open source. Make it modular. I wish that we had open source technology back then when we first started with BFAM, but today it is all about open source. Reuse it, put it out there in GitHub. I know that, that Treasury and OMB are doing that with their data standards. Everybody is having these kind of discussions on GitHub. And at MCC, that's all we did was building everything into open source and building a community around it. And we'd be happy to talk about this innovation stuff that happens when you're out there in open source. The 5th is having a flexible year-end money. It's very hard. As I'm learning now that I'm outside the federal government, I'm trying to get our brethren inside the government to do these innovation. It's hard because vehicles are not available. The federal system, as I said, procurement is very challenging. But having a flexible vehicle and then year-end money. By the way, year-end is coming up, so all of you guys should be thinking about how we could be doing this on a year-end. And I said BFAM got started with $60K year-end money, first year, and then second year. At MCC, it was a GS-15 for 6 months. That's around $60K as well. So $60K has always been my standard. 6 is refuse to take no for an answer. There's a lot of naysayers out there that say you can't do it. There's all kinds of reasons that you can't, you shouldn't, you couldn't. Ignore them. Go do it. Have a vision and take it. 7 is use small actors. Experiment with both with your work, with your people. This is critical piece, actually. Government IT contractors are big companies with large marketing budgets, existing contracting vehicles, lock you into proprietary solutions. Many may or many may not work, but only after you've spent millions. I've had that experience as a CFO at MCC. Millions of dollars, and it still doesn't work. They work partially at best. And then lastly is understand the need. I figured out what the pain point was in the case of BFAM. Everybody was doing everything on spreadsheets. They're not talking to each other. There's one agency that actually in the budget process, they lock people in a room with 3 laptops and their version of the spreadsheet. They try to make sure they all have the same numbers 3 times a year. It's pretty incredible. So understanding the business process, helping to figure out what the pain points are, with what you could relieve with small pieces of technology. Don't do it all, and I think, Jason, you mentioned it, trying to boil the ocean is not the way to go. And in open data, what we discover is getting the data out there in digital format as quickly as possible, and then engaging a community that's interested in your data. That you put somewhat of a standard out there, but sometimes the data that you put out there may not be in the format or in the standard that people are interested in, people want to use it. So either for transparency, accountability, or creating economic value, because actually digital assets are economic assets. Once you get it out there, you can find all kinds of actors out there, everybody, the private sector really are interested in your data to do a lot of things with it. And so it is a way to look at your data differently that you may not be able to see it. So with that, I'm happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you.
Chantale, you made a couple interesting points, I think, along that innovation piece that I'd like to foster a little bit more conversation around. And you were talking about the innovation during and after the change. And I think that's a key point, to be able to foster that innovation you have to have some kind of idea of what people want to do. But it's very hard to kind of open up the magic box and say, what do you want? Tell me and I'll make it happen. So if we can talk a little bit more about fostering that innovation from a leadership level, and get into a little bit of your ideas on how to do that. If you want to start with Phil, or?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think it's notable that fostering a community of innovation is already happening by taking input from the private sector about standards and formats and everything else. So that environment is already being created and needs to kind of be diffused throughout the entire process. But I think what is happening right now is this whole project is going to be a massive tipping for our whole society. When we get spending data done and innovators start adding value and analyzing that and providing things to consumers, to states, to communities, customized, individualized, I think it's going to whet a massive appetite. And sure as we're sitting here, the data transparency notion and the innovation that wraps around it is going to migrate to services. So you understand what the federal government's services are, and that's going to open up a whole nother range of things. So I think that the innovative community is already beginning by inclusion of the private sector with the leaders in the public sector, embracing the end goals of transparency and more innovation, more analysis, more republication with added value. So I think the culture is kind of on the way. The last observation I would make is that up to this point, primarily, the innovation and the culture includes a community like our sponsors here and others who have grown up living with federal spending data. That is their livelihood. There's a whole bunch of other innovators across the country who don't wake up and think that way every day. But they're going to begin to as this data becomes available and pliable and machine readable. New things are going to happen. GPS traces to a federal NIST standard. When GPS was created way back when, I don't think they had any idea of all the locational services, Waze, if you're familiar with Waze, to know where traffic jams are and so forth. So there are unforeseen things coming, and I think we're tipping.
Yeah, I think the innovation is, to a great extent, a cultural issue. And federal managers, from my perspective, have been so used to having to manage without the kind of information that can be made available with the Data Act that I think some of them will jump on it quickly. Others will perhaps say, well, I'm kind of used to doing it the same way. And so it's going to take people like Chantale and those organizations to do some small back office things and show what's possible. I think back on some of the work that we did in making most of our payments electronic when I was at FMS, and we didn't have very good data. How much it cost for making electronic payment versus a check payment, and we finally got that. But trying to manage, you knew instinctively that electronic was a lot less expensive, but without the kind of data that's there, we're grappling. And how much do you spend, for example, on marketing electronic if you don't know the relative cost of electronic versus checks? So I mean, those simple things that you think, well, that's pretty straightforward. But unless you have the data available and the willingness to use it, then it's not so simple, because you're just doing things the way they've been done forever.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because at MCC, I mentioned the first Presidential Innovation Fellow. He came in and he helped me with the 222 plan, get the data out there as quickly as possible in the formats that we can manage and sustain. And then the second Presidential Innovation Fellow that I hired, her sole job was to find value to that data. I talked about digital assets. That value to that data, we're supposed to go out and build a community for the users. It's not just enough to put that data out. It is really to create a value and a community around it. So what we did was we went to private sector companies like IBM, EY. Very interesting with EY. I don't know if there's EY folks out here. What they did was they took that data, put it into their proprietary software tool, because they actually, out in London, they have like a room full of screens. They put our data up there, and they sort of showed where the investments are going. Where are we spending money on what sectors? Is it roads? Is it power plants? All of that. So it's to their private sector clients that they bring into this room, and they show them that, okay, in this particular country, in Tanzania, for example, you've got roads that are leading here in the southern part, which is the breadbasket of the country. How about there's current investments, infrastructure investments there? Why don't we figure out, are there other opportunities, other investments that could be happening in that part of the country? So it took a lot of push and tug, but certainly that data became valuable to the private sector to show them where the investments are and where we could be doing more of. So it's not just getting the technology piece, but also helping to get economic growth.
Can I add one other innovative community that should be on your radar? It has to do with that woodshed. There's a whole lot of young, bright, tech-savvy staffers on Capitol Hill who are going to have access to data to slice and dice and look for correlations. So if you're a grant recipient, a contractor, a federal public servant, you can look for sharper questioning with more data. It should also lead to better oversight and better management, but sharper questioning, because those young folks up there are quite innovative as well.
Yeah. Oh, there's one more thing I forgot. Have you guys heard about hackathons? You know about hackathons? They do that in the health space. We're starting to have that in the financial space as well. So you bring hackers to come in, and the World Bank has been doing these. They call them, hacks of kindness. You get the data out there, and then you've got all these innovators. I mean, GPS is a good example of that, and the health space is also a good example of that, where you bring third-party apps, people who could actually help build applications for you on iPhones, on mobile technology, that could really further a lot of work that we in the government space could not do.
That's excellent. I mean, the hackathon idea and the whole concept of getting people in a room, I think, is really cool. You see it all the time when you bring those people together, those groups together, and the wheels start turning. It's an amazing type of a thing to be able to see. We're just about to the end of time. I just want to kind of reiterate some of the points I think we made up here. And I also, before I get into that, I really want to thank our distinguished panel. It was really good talking with you, talking with all of you out there as well, and getting to know you and some of the stuff that you guys are doing. The technological change is hard. Change is hard any way you do it. When you're doing technological change, changing systems, changing processes, changing people's minds, it's really difficult, but it's rewarding. And the Data Act represents an opportunity not just to comply with some standards, but to fix some long-standing problems that we've had within the government and public sector industry, private industry as well. And the accessibility to the standardized data is really the starting point, that platform for innovation across the board, across the federal government, state and local municipalities, and the private industry. And like with the GPS, it's going to explode. My kids are on their phone. I don't know what they're doing, but it's amazing. I didn't have a cell phone when I was a kid. When that data becomes available, it's amazing what people can do and what they can accomplish with it. And with that, we'll wrap it up, I think. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, folks.